if you read those few statements in the last slide, you will remember that, in fact, no information was to be leaked in any way, shape, or form about anything that the government wanted to keep secret. So, in fact, wouldn't you wonder that a prisoner of war camp, which was judged to be secret, its location was to be kept secret, no one was to know where it was going to be, that, in fact, the Toronto Telegram published not only that photograph, but the information that, in fact, a prisoner of war camp was in Ontario. Now, they didn't say where, but anybody who was a cottager in Muskoka would have recognized the corner right away, because that drugstore that was on the corner, which was at that time Maclay's, would have been familiar to everybody. And that's where they would have gotten all kinds of things, including their newspapers and their, all kinds of other things. So that, in fact, it wasn't exactly a secret location in any way, shape, or form. But somewhere in Ontario, we will keep it. Little review of your grade 10 history. On the 3rd of September, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. On the 10th, Canada followed. 1 week later, after having meetings, of course, the cabinet and parliament, they had to make a separate declaration because we were, in fact, of course, a separate country. There was great fear that, in fact, Britain would be invaded. A plan in Hitler's little playbook called Operation Sea Lion, that was his name for it, and it was going to be for the invasion of England by the Germans. And you could see that countries were just falling left and right up to here. We're looking at the first one to go, Denmark, the second one, the Netherlands, third, Belgium, fourth, Norway, and fifth, France. So all of those countries were just falling in sequence after the other to the Germans. So that Führer Directive number 16 was looking like something that might be going to be happening. And you'll have to remember as well from your geography classes just how very close the coastline of France is to the coastline of England. It would take absolutely nothing for an invading army to sail across that tiny body of water, the Channel, and land in England. And there was great worry because, in fact, we were winning in 1940. We were beginning to win certain battles, which meant we were getting prisoners of war. So right off the bat, we were winning in the air, we were winning on the water. And so with all of that, we were taking prisoners, and quite a number of them, all things considered. Now, if you keep them in England, you've got to feed them. And you've got a country that's going to have more and more difficulty getting food. They don't grow everything, and they didn't at the time grow everything that you would want to eat in your daily food. So they certainly didn't have enough food to feed prisoners of war. On top of that, if in fact they did attack England, then you would have a ready-made army in prisoner of war camps in England, just waiting to be liberated and join the invading forces. So there was great fear that in actual fact, Operation Sea Lion was going to happen, and that in fact, they would have a standing army of prisoners of war liberated by them. So what to do? Well, they approached Canada and said, would you take the prisoners of war that we've captured? And we said, yes, we will. And on June 10th, 1940, we were told 20 days, 400 prisoners of war are arriving. Now, that may or may not sound like a lot to you, but 400 prisoners of war have got to be found a place for. They've got to have a place where they are going to actually sleep, eat. They've got to have security of some kind. You've got to have people who are going to guard them. There are so many things that you can think of that would say 400 arriving in 20 days. That's like after you get the message, 20 days. So now we're down to like 18 days, and then it gets to be 15 days. And you've got to find a place for these guys. In Muskoka, that map down in the corner on the left, we had 4 sanatoriums for the treatment of tuberculosis. The first one opened in 1897. That was the first one in Canada, by the way, for the treatment of tuberculosis. The second sanatorium was opened in 1902 and was in fact the first free hospital in the world for the treatment of tuberculosis. So, and then 2 more opened after that. So we had these things already in place in various degrees of what should we call it, of usability. The one that you're looking at here in the picture on the right is called the Calidore Sanatorium. That was a sanatorium originally built in 1915 to treat patients who had tuberculosis, because many of the people who had tuberculosis, at least initially anyway, were found in the ranks of people who didn't have a lot of money. But of course, eventually tuberculosis just spread through the population generally. And so tuberculosis was an enormous killer around the turn of the century of people across Canada, across North America, across Europe. And we had the first sanatorium here, and we had the first free sanatorium in the world here. So where's the government going to look for a place to set up a prisoner of war camp? Well, very luckily, we had this Calidore Sanatorium, and it was sitting vacant and kind of had 1935, there was nobody in there. It had been used, as I say, as a sanatorium, but by then we had found all kinds of drugs and so on, or we're beginning to find them to treat people with tuberculosis. So it was sitting empty, waiting, just waiting.
I'm okay.
Hard to see those pictures completely there, but how do you change a 25-year-old sanatorium in what is now 15 days into a prisoner of war camp for 400 people?
Oh, did you? Okay.
At first it was in 20 days, and then it's 15 days. And have we found a place yet for these people? 400 men who have to be guarded, fed, housed, all of that. Not easy to do just off the cuff. So where am I here? Okay, so we have got Germans of all ranks coming to Canada, and there are 400 of them, and they're going to land at the train station in Gravenhurst. And everybody knows where the train station is, hopefully. And they're going to land there, and they're going to be marched to wherever it is we're going to put them. So in fact, of course, they were lucky enough to find where that red line is, the Calidore Sanatorium property, and it was vacant. It had been sitting vacant for 5 years. TB was pretty much on the wane. People were now being treated at home or close to home. And so in fact, that property was sitting more or less vacant, I guess we could call it. And if you're thinking about where are we talking about, drive straight out the main street as far as you can possibly go to Lawrence Street, go down Lawrence Street right to the water, and you're there. Okay, and there's a walking trail, just to mention it right now, right along the water's edge, because we were lucky enough that the man who owned the property gave us deed to the land that's right along the water's edge. And so in fact, you can do a walking trail with about 12 to 14 interpretive panels all along it that I designed 3 years ago, I guess, and Municipal Heritage Committee put them in. So you can do a sort of a guided walk right along the water, and easy walk, not too much in the way of hilly and along it and so on. Are very, very tip, and you'll notice that we're right on the water. That will come into play. The sanatoriums may or may not be familiar names to you. This is Minnewaska, which started out as a little tourist hotel. Lovely though it was, but so small that it couldn't compete with the big tourist hotels. So in fact, it got turned into briefly into a sanatorium. And that's what it looked like there. That's a postcard in 1908 under Dr. Parfit. Dr. Charles Parfit was really planning on making some money out of this. He decided he would have a sanatorium that would be for the well-to-do. But in the meantime, he bought up this little old hotel and used that until, in fact, which was the Calidore Sanatorium, and then the Madawaska was torn down. This one here was for the well-to-do. It had pink slate roof. May imagine gray walls. It was a very attractive looking building, and of course had pieces added onto it and added onto it. and added on to it, to the point where, of course, trying to cope with all the people with tuberculosis and all the soldiers coming back from the First World War who had actually acquired, we shall call it, tuberculosis in the war, or other kinds of lung disease like trench lung, so on. They were being shipped here too. So his vision of having one for the well-to-do was very quickly slashed in half, and he was told, no, you're going to be taking soldiers, and lots of them. So in fact, it was closed because by then, TB was on the wane. It was being treated with antibiotics and so on. So here we are back to where we stopped a minute ago. How to change a 25-year-old sanatorium into a prisoner of war camp for 400 prisoners in 15 days. Think of the things you're going to need to do. That building was built in 1916. This is now 1940. Think about all the things that would have to be upgraded, redone, rebuilt, remade, everything from all the piping, the water access, the sanitary systems, you name it, everything had to be redone. And on top of that, now we're talking 400 soldiers, and we're talking about trying to have kitchens big enough to cook their food, on and on and on. And chain link fences 10 feet high with barbed wire along the top, and accommodation for all the soldiers who are going to be there to guard. Administering a prisoner of war camp would be no mean feat, because you were getting orders from just about every direction. You were getting orders from the detaining power, now that's England, and orders from the National Defense Department, Canada. And you were getting then some orders from lower echelons in Ottawa who were saying, oh, but you've got to do this, you've got to do that. And then there's a guy who's the adjutant general in charge of prisoner of war camps. He's got to have a say. And then you've got the district commanding officer who's, in charge of a big chunk of Ontario. Before you know it, you've got more people whispering in your ear what you should be doing than you could possibly imagine. Administering a prisoner of war camp then had some people who were on site and some people who were not on site who were giving the orders. And the whole thing, no matter what it was, whose person it was that was giving the orders, everything came down to the Geneva Convention of 1929. That's where all the rules came. So when you're thinking about what you're looking at, the Geneva Conventions in every war were the things that determined how prisoners were going to be treated, how soldiers were going to be treated, and so on. So this is where all of the rules came for this particular camp. And look at all the people who are going to be talking to him. You've got the head of the Royal Canadian Engineers who are doing all the building and work and the fences and all that stuff. And you've got the Veterans Guard of guarding, and they've got a guy in charge. And you're going to be talking about the headquarters staff, and they've got a person in charge. And you've got an interpreter, and you've got a medical staff, and they're all reporting to one poor guy who has more people coming at his ears than you can shake a stick at. Overall, there are three groups of people, I guess you could call them, who are kind of in charge of making sure that everything is being done the way it should be. You've got the protecting power, which was the neutral country of Switzerland. So they've got a person who is coming regularly to the camp to make sure that everything is being done according to Hoyle. And you've got the International Committee of the Red Cross, who are visiting regularly and facilitating things between prisoners and guards. They, in fact, are supposed to be completely neutral, okay? And then you've got the War Prisoners Aid of the International YMCA, which, in fact, even though we had a Canadian YMCA, that's largely an American organization. And they're going to be in charge of providing educational, cultural, spiritual, recreational stuff for all of the prisoners of war, because the Geneva Convention said you can't have them just sitting around doing nothing. They have to be provided with reading material. They have to be provided with religious services. And of course, you've got to meet all of the religious needs of them. They might be Roman Catholic, they might be whatever, Methodist. You've got a commanding officer of the Veterans Guard of Canada, and he's going to be reporting to all of these people. And you're constantly changing who that person is, because the Veterans Guard of Canada was in platoons, and it would come as a platoon of about 200 to 215 guards, and they would be here for 2 months. And then off they would go for R&R, and they would go to a different camp because they didn't want anyone building relationships with the prisoners. Right? I mean, you've got to be careful, remembering that many of these Germans, well, we'll get into it in a minute, but many of these Germans are well educated and they speak English. So in fact, if they're decent people, nice people, and you get to know them, you can start to strike up a bit of a relationship. So in order to combat that and to make sure that none of the girls hanging around the fences who are looking at all of these men, that they're not getting into relationships with anyone either. So they just kept transferring them out one platoon at a time. Yes, ma'am. I haven't gotten there yet. So right now we're just told we're getting 400 whatevers. Yeah. Notice, by the way, on that last slide that it said unarmed. The people who are going to be guarding the camp will be unarmed. Okay. There's a view of part of a platoon standing outside the place where their trucks were. And that's a part of a platoon of Veterans Guard who were going to be looking after guarding the prisoners of war. Now, the Veterans Guard, just as it sounds, they were former soldiers of the First World War. They wanted a part in the Second World War. They weren't judged to be, in most cases, physically fit enough or maybe young enough to be, in fact, used as soldiers at the front. So, in fact, they were going to be used to guard. And they were guarding other installations like hydro installations and all kinds of places. Anywhere where they thought sabotage could take place, anywhere where they thought that people could somehow make use of what they were guarding. People being Germans. For the actual prisoners of war, there was going to be a spokesperson too, who was also going to be bending the ear of the commanding officer of the camp. And he was called a Lagerführer. That man standing there, who's not looking just his very best, is in fact the Lagerführer initially. And he had a number of jobs to do. He was in charge of various areas and having POWs there for various areas, because of course, if they were not officers, if they were in fact regular ranks, they were going to be doing the cooking, they were going to be cleaning, they were going to be, and everybody would be playing sports and so on. And of course, he did happen to be a member of the escape committee. On June the 30th, 1940, 476 prisoners of war, closer to 500, detrained in Gravenhurst at the Gravenhurst train station. There was a little girl in the train station at the time, sitting on a bench just at the window. I suspect she was waiting for your grandparents to arrive in the train. In those days, we used to have multiple trains arriving every day and departing every day for Toronto and places north. She's sitting at the window, looking out over the tracks as the train rolls in, and 476 German prisoners of war detrained. And she's got her little nose pressed to the window, of course, and she probably doesn't understand what's going on, but she's looking at all these guys getting off this train. One of the prisoners comes over and he goes like this and taps on the window, and he says, probably thinking of his own little girl at home, because many of these guys, of course, were family members. She was really taken aback and sort of got out of the train station really fast. I think she felt like, oh my gosh, he could have come in here. Anyway, there they were, not to be told where they were at all. We weren't supposed to know where the prisoner of war camp was. It wasn't going to be reported in the paper, so that in fact, when the Toronto Star printed these two pictures the next day, those were in fact illegal pictures, but they were taken by a photographer for the Toronto Star, and he got a nice picture of both of them. And of course, it isn't labeled, but if you were a tourist or a cottager in Gravenhurst and you saw Maclay's drugstore over there, you might think to yourself, I think I know where that is. They were paraded through town using various routes, because of course this kind of bringing in prisoners of war and so on took place a number of times, sending out some, bringing in some. So this time they're walking along John Street, And people were sort of lined. You can see a lady just here at the edge of the photograph. People would come outside and stand along the street with their children. You can imagine the ones who had loved ones fighting in Europe against the Germans, and they're watching all these Germans march through town. It was either dead silence or hissing through the people along the side of the street. They're standing there, they're watching. You can see the people over there on the left-hand side of the picture. And these, of course, are Lord Strathcona's best young soldiers who are bringing them in, but they will not be the people guarding them. They'll be the Veterans Guard that will actually be guarding them later on. These guys are just escorting them on the train and from the train to the prisoner of war camp. That map will give you some idea of the size, 35 acres, of the prisoner of war camp. That pentagon in the center outlined in red was the area for the Germans. All the rest of it had buildings to do with Veterans Guard and the people running the camp and so on. So the Canadians had a bunch of buildings down here. You can see, if you look at that pentagon and you look at that curved building, that's the original Calidore Sanatorium, that curved building in the middle of that pentagon. Gives you some idea. People sort of have a bit of an orientation and know where we are in Gravenhurst, relatively speaking. So again, that gives you just a bit of a breakdown on, the sentries, the guard towers, the prisoners of war, the Canadians, and where everybody is more or less. Imagine putting that together as quickly as they had to. All you started out with was the Calidore Sanatorium building. And you had to put together a camp that not only housed 475, make it 500 German prisoners of war, but all the people who are going to be cooking, who are going to be building, maintaining, cleaning, and so on, until they could get things sorted out with the Germans themselves as to who was going to be doing what. And you had all the people doing the administration, people who knew Tiny Firth at a time when earlier on was one of the people who worked in administration in that camp, and he had more stories to tell and spent lots of time telling me those stories, sitting on my couch for years. I taught with him as well in the high school. That gives you a bit of an idea of what the property looked like. The Calidore Sanatorium is that lovely looking building back there in the background. And then that's like fence all the way around the swimming area. And it is hooked right into the bottom, into the rocks at the bottom. So in actual fact, if you thought you were going to dive down and go under the fence and get out on the other side, that was not going to happen. They were actually hooked right into the rocks. That years later, people after the war and be hunting for souvenirs and whatnot, bits of barbed wire down in the rocks. Initially called Camp C, eventually it was called Camp 20 or Camp Calidore. Initially, it was for everyone. Eventually, because of the quality of the building that we had here, that beautiful Calidore Sanatorium, they decided to make this an officers' camp because, in fact, it would be of a reasonable expectation by German officers to be housed in a building like that, as opposed to being in huts, tents, the kinds of buildings that many of the general run-of-the-mill soldiers were in. You can see that we had colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors, U-boat commanders, you name it, the elite of the German Army, Navy, and Air Force. And included in that group, look at the kinds of backgrounds that they had. Scientists, doctors, teachers, landscape architects. We had chefs, electricians, you name it, everything involved in the prisoners of war and all the skill sets that they brought with them. And you can imagine a couple of those skill sets might have been useful for escaping. So if you were really, really good at certain kinds of things, you might be, if you, for instance, you were somebody who could make clothing, and you've seen enough of the movies of making clothing too. But think of where they are. They're in Gravenhurst. It's not like Germany. It's not like, you're 10 miles from the next village at the very most, maybe 5 miles from the next village in Germany or anywhere in Europe. Here, and especially in the wintertime, 10 miles might as well be 1,000 miles, because if you don't have a car, or a car that can actually make it in the winter, in actual fact, you could be 1,000 miles from anywhere in Gravenhurst, and it's of no value. You've got to have, well, for a starter, we've got a 10-foot chain link fence, and we've got winter. So we've got lots of things to sort of keep these guys in. So there's that chain link fence again, right down to the water. A man named Henry Fry was a photographer of some note. He was the man that took those pictures for the Toronto Star. In actual fact, he was commissioned by the government to take photographs of prisoners of war in tens. So 10 by 10 by 10, taking pictures of the prisoners of war. We have them in our archives, in Gravenhurst archives. And in fact, those could be then sent home to family members of the German prisoners to tell them, your son is safe. Not where he is, but he's safe. And that was just a courtesy sort of thing. Now, they weren't just wandering around in their old uniforms, although it started out that way, but very quickly they were given things to wear. Now, you might be thinking, oh, well, they sewed that big red thing on the back of their shirt. Just cut that off and, take out the stitches and it's fine. No, they didn't do it that way. They cut a big hole in the shirt first, inserted the red spot, so that if you tried to take the red spot out, you've got a big hole in the shirt. So in actual fact, a lot of extra sewing and work, but it made that shirt not able to be turned into a regular blue jeans kind of shirt. The same thing was true of the pants. So down the right leg of one and the left leg of the other. So you'd have on this inside, on this one, the outside, you had a strip taken right out of the pants and a red strip put into the pants. A whole lot of people got sewing work to make those, well, almost 500 uniforms for prisoners of war. And you can see them, they're out skating there. And you can see the spots on the backs of their shirts. Easy to spot. There was such a thing as parole in a prisoner of war camp in Canada. Now, it's not like parole like you have from prisoners, for prisoners these days in the correctional services. This is, in fact, a privilege that was based on a couple of things that we have very limited understanding of now. But at one time, it was assumed that if you were an officer, you were a gentleman. Now, a gentleman can be trusted. His word is his bond. So if, in fact, an officer gave his word that he would not try to escape when he was out with whomever, he could be trusted. And he would not try to escape. As soon as he came back to the camp and was inside the fence, all bets were off. He could try to escape as much as he liked. But if he was out on parole, and that meant signing up a piece of paper saying, I'm going out for a walk, or having a little block of wood, if he couldn't write in English, he would have a little block of wood with his name on it. He would hand that in, and then he could go out and pick blueberries or whatever. There'd be a soldier who would go with a bunch of guys. They didn't tend to go out into the community, say go uptown, whatever, because they probably feared for what might happen to them. You think of the number of people in the community who had sons and husbands and fathers and so on, who were in fact fighting in Europe. They might not have felt very safe just being out in the community. So in fact, they would generally speaking go with an officer of the Veterans Guards or with a soldier and go blueberry picking or whatever it would happen to be. But generally speaking, they didn't really leave the camp. They had a lot of activities. You've already seen that they were able to so on too. In actual fact, the Geneva Conventions of 1929 said one of the things you had to do, and there's the article in yellow, you had to, in some way, organize intellectual and sporting pursuits for prisoners of war. Now, before you start to jump on the bandwagon and go, oh my gosh, that's not what happened to our soldiers in Germany. Well, of course, in Germany, they're in the middle of a war. We're not. There's no war happening in Canada. I mean, we've declared war, but it's not around us. We're not being bombed. We're not being shot at. In actual fact, in Germany, that couldn't possibly take place because they're being shot at. So in actual fact, all of these kinds of activities could be organized for prisoners of war. So they had a library of German books, huge library. Eventually, a library so big that it was bigger. Toronto. They also had books in French, Italian, and Russian, and so on, because they were learning other languages in their classes. They also had orchestras, and they had chamber music ensembles, and they had instruments galore, because the YMCA provided all of those instruments to them to learn and play music. Thinking of the fact that this had become an officers' camp fairly quickly, in actual fact, many of them already played musical instruments. They already played in chamber music ensembles or in symphonies or whatever. They read endlessly. They were well educated, many of them with university degrees. So in actual fact, these are people who already are ready for whatever you can give them in the way of intellectual, musical pursuits. Interestingly enough, don't know if the numbers are there. Yes, 440 by 1941, 440 of the 476 POWs were enrolled in courses. They wanted to improve themselves. They figured Germany was going to win the war. So in actual fact, when Germany wins the war and is in control of the world, in fact, these people will be have taken all these courses to move up into the ranks of administration and so on. So they were taking everything from soup to nuts. And you can see here all the different languages and so on. Interestingly enough, not only did a University of Toronto professor come in on a regular basis who spoke German and helped the students with the courses that they were taking from U of T, but you also had actual people who were prisoners teaching other prisoners courses that are listed in that list of courses there. So they're studying for careers that they're going to take up once Germany has won the war and they are in charge. Some of them might have been realistic to know that wasn't what was happening, but yeah.
Lived in Germany for 12 years. I just came back.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk to friends or people, it's interesting to hear the opinions of what their grandfathers or great-grandfathers
I'd have thought.
really thought.
Yeah.
Did these people, were they true Nazis? And did they really, was it a mixed bag?
Very mixed bag. Very mixed bag of prisoners of war. Remember that in your Navy, Air Force, and Army, you have career soldiers, Marines, and so on, men who work as a living at being a soldier or an aviator or whatever it happens to be. So they're not necessarily Nazis. They're just, they've been conscripted to fly the planes or sail the ships or whatever. You've got hard-nosed Nazis who have, in fact, joined whatever particular group it is, Marines or aviators, to, in fact, help to win the war. And you've got everything in between. Because remember, conscription is going on in Germany. And so in actual fact, they're going to be conscripted into whatever unit is the best suited to their skills and so on. Mm-hmm. Did they believe they were going to win the war? Yes, I think many, many, many of them did. At the beginning and certainly into the middle, there were still people who were hardened Nazis who by the end still believed they had been going to win the war and that it was not true that they had lost. Yep, yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, yeah, oh yeah, well, that's another whole story. Yeah, so we'll get to that in a moment. But in fact, yeah, there was a mixed bag of everything, mixed bag of skills and so on. Once it became an officers' camp, we did have other ranks who were there to the cooking, whatever it happened to be. Generally speaking, we now had an officers' camp of over 400 officers, and the men who were needed to look after them, to serve them. Those were the grunts. Well, as my father would call himself, a grunt. He was a regular private in the Canadian Army. Under that Geneva Convention, we're going to supply them with all kinds of instruments, and we're going to give them lots of sports to play. We're going to be able to teach them all kinds of courses and so on. What to do with your day as a prisoner of war was perhaps the question, because now we're really talking about officers. So in fact, we've got people playing tennis and we've got people swimming. We actually had some of them using their skills in the town of Gravenhurst. So we had a man who was a parks planner, German, POW, who said, look at town of Gravenhurst, if you want me to, I can design for you a plan for your park if you'd like me to. And he did. He Gull Lake Park. There was a big archway and all the stonework that was along the waterfront. As you can see there, the steps that went down. He designed all of that. And the town of Gravenhurst, along with prisoners of war, did all of that building and putting in the stone and so on. Now, a lot of that has been changed and moved around as time went on. But in actual fact, he was quite happy to use his skills. It meant he got out of the camp. He got to come and look at the place, got to use what it was he was good at doing. And we got it for free. A lot of sports went on there. So they got hockey equipment from all over the place because, of course, the YMCA was providing them with hockey equipment. They had a tennis court, which could be flooded in the wintertime to make a rink. They had a sports field where they could play footy or soccer. They had a track for running, a boxing ring, gymnastics workout area, you name it. They could pretty much do anything in the way of sports, tennis and so on. Yes. YMCA. Yeah.
Not the Canadian one. International.
International YMCA, yeah. Yeah, not the Canadian one. So there they were, living kind of the life of luxury, if you want to know the truth. And a lot of people, yeah, oh, absolutely. I like to tell and Germans, my God, they were living a far more difficult life than we were. They were in the middle of being bombed and shot at. So not a good place for you to be in Germany either. But in actual fact, there's a story of a woman who was near the train station when they were starting to unload food for the prisoner of war camp. And they're unloading crates of peaches. Well, her daughter hasn't had a peach in about 2 years and doesn't kind of even know what that is. And those are all going out to a prisoner of war camp. And so apparently she stood there and cried. They had pets. So the Americans made sure that if they wanted pets, they got pets. So in actual fact, you can see Scotty dogs in the picture over there. Hassan Pfeffer is over here, I like to call them, because of course, rabbits can be turned into a meal fairly quickly. And of course, rabbits can be turned into more rabbits pretty quickly as well. So rabbits multiply in a way that probably no other animal does. So in fact, not only were they pets, but they were also dinner. They had monkeys. And in fact, a rumor went around, which in fact wasn't really a rumor, from one prison camp to another, that there's a story out there of a prisoner of war camp that actually has a menagerie with monkeys and cats, dogs, snakes, bunnies, you name it, all living in this menagerie. Actual fact, it was the one here. Not all of our prisoner of war camps, by the way, were like this because they weren't for officers. This was an officer's camp. Quite a difference. So where did all this stuff come from? Well, the officers were still being paid by the German government up to a certain point in the war. So they were getting that money. They couldn't hold the money in their own hands. It went into a general account. Things could be purchased. Other ranks got a smaller amount of pay, and eventually that petered out as the Germans were starting to lose more and more, lose the war. No prisoner was allowed to have cash, but they could get a chit, and that chit would then allow them to go to the little canteen and get like a bottle of beer or whatever it happened to be. Gifts from family. gifts from sympathetic Americans. And there were lots of those. Most items came from the Prisoners' War Relief Fund from the YMCA. If you were a regular old POW, we had a few of those, we had about 50 of them, you could go to the canteen with your chits and you could get maybe a piece of fruit or a piece of like some socks or whatever. There were certain kinds of rules about what you could and couldn't get. The one at the bottom always intrigues me. I comment on it every time. The annual allotment of 1 pair of slippers for every 3 prisoners. Now work that one out for yourself and see what exactly that would mean. I get a pair every 3 years. I get 1 slipper every year. I'm not really sure how that worked, but in fact, that was the rule. They couldn't get woodworking tools, obviously, or skin lotions and so on, but they could get a lot of other things. Now remember that rationing is starting to come in Canada as well. So in actual fact, we've got a situation where things are being paid for by other groups of people, and we may not have access to the things that they're starting to get. So this is all very complicated. The reality in an officers' camp like ours, which was the only officers' camp, was this. You had a commandant who would sign off on the order that somebody was placing. He could, in fact, approve or deny that order. But if the person was placing an order for some fruit, he would sign on that. It started out really well in 1940 when this camp sort of opened up. Simple things. They wanted German Bibles, of course. They wanted a little more soap, a few balls like soccer balls, so on. In 1941, the request started to become a little more ambitious because most of the things had all been signed. So, let's try for some more. You know what people are like. I mean, you go for more if you can, right? So in actual fact, it did become a little more ambitious. And in fact, they were looking for musical instruments, German books, newspapers, and sports equipment. And in 1942, things started to up. In 1943, they were using the Eatons and Simpsons catalog, and they were ordering things to be delivered to the camp. Where did they get the catalogs? Well, from the guards, right? And so, in fact, you can see some of the things that they were ordering, to the point where, in fact, the directive came down from the National Defense saying, curb the orgy of spending at Camp 20, please. That really didn't happen immediately. And so they had to send out another memo and say, take away all the catalogs and do not allow them back again. Okay. Yep, that's what they were spending. What the prisoners were spending totally. Yeah. Oh no, gosh, no. But putting together, 500 soldiers, we're not talking more than about $10 a month. But in 1943, they could get beer and so on. It was all looking good. If somebody has to go over there, don't hesitate to. Monthly income could really add up. And so, yes.
In 1942, it's the equivalent of $100,000.
Gives you an idea of their purchasing power, right? Yeah. You good? Hang on. I'm not there yet. Oh, I know what you're saying. And I'm just laughing and thinking you're going to be surprised in a minute. That monthly income really did add up. And in fact, they could buy quite a lot of stuff. Their spending habits were getting a little crazy. And they decided they had all that money in the bank. Well, farm, and some of you will know that it was located where the park is today. The Passmore farmhouse had burned down just before the war. And so in fact, Passmore farm was being empty. And so these guys decided, we've got all that money. Think of the purchasing power of $23,000 at this time. Yeah, in fact, they bought the Passmore farm.
POWs.
The POWs bought the Passmore farm.
And I think at the time it's really insignificant by land. in Canada. Slavics couldn't even buy land, but prisoners of war could buy land.
They leased it, yes, they leased it, yeah. From Germany as long as they could be, yeah. By the Germans, yeah, after the war, yeah. In Canada, yeah. Yep. Exactly. Yep.
Question I had about salaries were, I believe they were individual salaries were that large. Well, so individual officers could order canteen for the material.
They could.
A lump sum that was spent all at once. Individual officers within the camp who would say, this is my request for this month. I want, so many cigars. I'd like this razor blade. I want such and such.
Yeah. That had to all be approved, of course, by the camp commandant. And in fact, all that money was in fact collected in one account. And that money was all there to be used judiciously as acted. They didn't have control of their own money. I don't think they did. Yep. Yeah, okay, no, they didn't have control. They had, their money was going into that one account. And then in fact, we only really had officers here. We had very, very few enlisted men, shall we say. So that in fact, the money that was in there was all from officers' salaries. Yep.
For a captain of 20.
Yep.
depends on
Yep, you're right.
20.
Absolutely.
It all depends on your salary. So if you
Mhm.
40 or more, you have different requests for you have more money than someone at 20 would all money that somebody made a decision with.
To some degree, and to some degree as well, there were overseeing requests from the camp commandant, English, the camp commandant, German, and they had control as well of how some of the money was spent. This is the farm that they leased, the Passmore farm. Lieutenant Colonel Wustervelt, in fact, is shown there. He's not a man who's afraid to work. You can see over here on the right-hand bottom side, his plowing is being done the old-fashioned, very hard way with a couple of horses. They had 3 horses, and there are hens, 1 per man. So lots of eggs, and I guess you could eat a hen that lays eggs, even though it's not the best eating once they stop laying. And they actually built a stable as well. They had a piggery. They had as many animals and so on as they really needed. Yes. They also had, of course, because they were officers, they had put in their parole, saying they would not escape. And they didn't. They didn't try to escape if they were officers, and had said they wouldn't. Yeah, maybe it would be at this point for sure. Germany was suffering very badly by 1944 for sure, if not by 43. They actually made themselves a garden eventually, but they got all kinds of books first to find out how you would do that, because in fact, they were not people who had normally done gardening of their own. They had had gardeners at home when they were growing up in many cases. So they actually learned how to create a garden, and they built their first garden in 44, which turned their kitchen camp into a lot better food producing than had been done before. If you were to take a turnip and hand it to me, as opposed to taking a turnip and handing it to a chef, what could be done with a turnip would be a whole lot better over there than it would be in my hands. And that was actually true of the guys who were doing the cooking in the camp as well. If you had a chef in charge, which they did have chefs, people who had been prisoners, but chefs before, the food in the POW camp was better because they could turn food into something a lot more tasty. If you've got this kind of life, and if you're even remotely aware, which they mostly were not aware of how bad things were in Germany, why would you ever want to escape and get home? Was there a duty to try to escape? No, there wasn't. There was no written duty to try to escape. There's nothing written down that says you must tried to escape. Now, there were things said by officers to enlisted men and so on. You know, you should be trying to really cause the army that's got you in prison. You should be trying to cause them all kinds of havoc and difficulties. You should be trying to escape all the time. And that was certainly said to prisoners of war on both sides. But in actual fact, there's nothing that says they should be trying to do that. What was the maximum penalty for an escape attempt? Well, in the Geneva Convention, it's 28 days in the whatever camp jail, let's call it, or the, camp jail. The cooler, exactly. Yep. And why would a POW take that risk? Well, let's take a look at some of the ones who did. There were a lot of different ways that people tried to escape. Now think about where they are. They're out on the rocks beside the lake. Winter weather, not too many communities close by. Just think about some of the things that are governing all of this. So the very first guy who tries to escape is the kind of guy you don't want on your team, no matter what. You had people who were digging a tunnel. This is not an easy thing to do in Gravenhurst. There's more rock than you can shake a stick at, and you don't really have an easy way of creating a tunnel. So 100 men had been working at trying to dig a tunnel, and they, were making some progress. They kept running into rock, but, So this guy, instead of waiting for the 100 or so who were destined to escape through this tunnel, decides he's going to go himself, by himself. He's the kind of a guy, as I say, you don't want playing on your side. In actual fact, he gets caught 3 days later, gets 3 days of freedom, gets 28 days in the camp jail, and a lot of people really hate him among the prisoners of war that he has to go back to, because he's just blowing their cover. He's blowing their escape attempt. Whoopsie daisy. Let's go this way. Escape by vehicle. Well, this camp was in constant change because, of course, it was being built as they went. For the first 2 or 3 years, I mean, it wasn't a camp at all. It was a camp under construction. So there were vehicles in and out. There were vehicles in and out delivering food and so on. And so, in fact, 2 guys named Kempe and Hoosh decided to stick a board underneath 2 different trucks. They just would have, create a little bit of a confusion over here while they just slide a piece of board in underneath the truck and then crawl onto that board, and they, ride the truck out of the camp. They were free for 12 hours, were caught. And in fact, one of them had tea and Bala. But then they were caught and they spent 28 days in the guardhouse. Escape by packing case. Well, packing cases were delivered to the camp all the time. And so one of them decided that, I've got to get back to my sweetheart. I've married her by proxy, but I haven't been with her. I need to get back to her. And so, in fact, he managed to crawl himself into a packing case, and he was taken to the station platform, put on the train, delivered to Toronto. They open the packing case, soldier is there. They take him out, they put him back on the train, they send him back to Gravenhurst, and he's been free for 18 hours, and in fact, 28 days in the Hooskow. Escape by mattress cover. This was not well thought out. These guys were looking for a way out of the camp by water. So they got the 2 mattress covers from their 2 beds, which were dark brown, and they managed to smuggle them in their towels. Wrap your towel around the mattress cover. Climb into the mattress cover. Once you get it underwater, you sort of climb in, slither in, and then you sort of work the mattress cover over to the shore, and you're going to emerge and then take off. In actual fact, they did get it over to the shore, but they were still inside the camp. So all the best laid plans of mice and men, of course, gang after glay, and these guys had 3 hours of submerged freedom and 28 days in the guardhouse. Escape by pillowcase. This is a wintertime escape. So in fact, they've got white pillowcases and they are fairly large. So they tunnel through the snow in their pillowcases and sheets. They're wrapped up in white. And one is found in a gully just outside the camp. One is found in Washago. I'm not sure how he got there. One was found in Stroud. Now, I don't really know what piece of equipment he was on or how he got there, but in fact, there are stories about it. There are at least 2 or 3 versions of that. And 2 on a snowplow in Barrie. Now, when you read that, you think, oh, they got on the snowplow, they got in the snowplow, whatever, and got to Barrie. No, they're actually on the front of the snowplow on the part that's plowing. And they're, how it has a sort of a lean to it and a little ridge at the bottom. They're standing on the snowplow. When they found them in Barrie, they were pretty much frozen in place. And so they thawed them out and sent them on back to camp again. Yeah. The other one, him. The 7th man was still missing. Escape by plastic surgery. This man hadn't left the camp at all. He'd gone up into the attic, believing probably that Germany was going to win the war and that they would, be liberated out of the camp, blah, blah. So he's up in the attic and he's found 4 months later, prisoners have been feeding him, giving him food up through. But in actual fact, while he's been up there, he's been doing plastic surgery on himself and thinking that he's somehow going to look different than the man they're looking for. In actual fact, he did look different, but he was in very bad shape. And after living for 4 months, bleeding, et cetera, in the crawl spaces, he was found and captured and taken back to, actually, I think to Bowmanville at that point. Oh, yes, this was escape by drowning. Well, Peter Krug was nabbed in North Bay. In actual fact, he had 10 hours of freedom and 28 days in the guardhouse again. But in actual fact, they were humiliated that some of these people had actually made it away from Gravenhurst. Not us, Gravenhurst people, but in fact, the people who were supposed to be guarding them. So they were very glad to have picked him up and gotten him. The one that got away never got here at all. So we might say he got away, but he didn't get away from Gravenhurst. Walter Manhart escaped off a train coming to bring him to Toronto and then to Gravenhurst. He got off the train. It was in, I think in April, maybe. No, August, it says there. He escaped off the train somewhere in the route between Montreal and Toronto. And he headed across and got to the United States. Now, they were told by a lot of people, by letters that they got and so on, they were told where they could go in New York State or Michigan, where they would find a home that would treat them well and help them get back to Germany. So a lot of had names of places that they could go in the United States, that they could get help, that they could get shelter, food, and so on, and then help on their way back. So this guy escaped from the train and in actual fact did get to the United States successfully. He got to New York State. He got a job. His English was wonderful. He got a job as a teacher in the United States. He lived in the United States until I think 1991, and then came to Canada to see where the camp had been that he was destined to have been in. So in actual fact, he married in the United States, had children there.
It's his religion.
Yeah. But are you thinking what? That there were lots of Germans who were Roman Catholic. Yeah. Oh, tons and tons of Germans, both in Canada and the US, but particularly in the United States. A lot of Germans who had already made it very clear that they would help. The last escape attempt from Camp 20 came on the part of these 2 guys. One of them, a guy named Funter, actually got all the way to Montreal, and he was quite a good hockey player. So he worked as a waiter in a restaurant where a lot of the hockey players ate. And they needed somebody, I guess, whether somebody got nailed or whatever, they needed somebody to take one of the places on one of their hockey teams, practicing in Montreal. And so, in fact, he got a place on a hockey team to practice, and actually played in Montreal in the Forum. Briefly, not at a hockey game, like Forum game, but in practice. He had done a number of past escapes, so in fact, he was put in Bowmanville. Colme got to Montreal, but he was captured just within days. You needed somebody who was really quick on the ball, who could know that he needed to ask for papers and so on. And if you didn't have somebody talking to one of these prisoners who had escaped, who really kind of had an idea what to do to stop these people from getting away, if you had some idea, then in fact you could identify a German escapee. In 1944, they started to categorize prisoners. I think we knew already that we were winning. They may not have, but we did. And so they started to categorize prisoners for the various camps so that they could sort of organize them and how many guards they needed in each camp. So they were hardline pro-Germany, but maybe had just been, sort of conscripted, but they weren't necessarily members of the Nazi Party. And then conscripts, people who are just like any conscript, they're just told they have to go and fight. They removed all the hardline Nazis from the rest of the camps and put them all in one place, because in Alberta, there were 2 murders that took place by hardline Nazis of other prisoners who weren't hardline enough. So in actual fact, where did all the really hardline guys come? By this end of the war, near the end of the war, they came to Gravenhurst. They were sent here. The war came to an end, but not for the POWs. The war in Europe was ending after a bunch of surrenders and suicides, I've said there. And in actual fact, it really ended officially on the 8th of May, 1945, which was VE Day. The horrors of what had gone on in camps where so many Jews were, 6 million were massacred, was finally starting to come to light. A lot of the Germans who had not been a part of their military for a long time because they've been prisoners didn't even know that that kind of thing had been happening. So I'm sure that if they believed it at all, they believed it to be propaganda, or certainly couldn't be true. In actual fact, of course, it was. So we were starting to try to sort these guys out into hardline and so on, and then figuring out where was everybody going to go now that the war had ended, because so many people had been moved from their homes and had to flee and go somewhere else. So the first thing that was going to happen was you were going to repatriate the people who had in fact been taken from their homes or had to move from their homes. You were going to return all the internees who were just people who were Italians or Germans living in Canada, but in actual fact and Japanese who had been interned, but in actual fact had nothing to do with the war itself. And it was really the POWs who were going to be the very last ones who were returned after all the soldiers and so on. As makes sense. They were gradually shipped, in many cases, to the UK to do work, cleaning up rubble in all the bombed buildings and so on. In actual fact, they were collected here, generally speaking, and then shipped from here to Montreal and back to wherever they were going to go overseas. They were working in reconstruction, generally speaking. So the camps were being closed down. Now, there were 27 camps in Canada, 27 POW camps, as many or slightly more in the United States. So they were shipping these guys at the very end of everybody else being sent home. So in the end, what was the legacy of Camp 20? The end of the war. Well, on July 31st, 1947, this was an ad in the Banner, and basically it was for sale, choice property, right on the lake, of course it was. And in fact, the property would consist of 35.5 acres and an awful lot of buildings and 2,000 feet of frontage on Lake Muskoka. At the very first, British Leyland, people who used to make Triumph, KR6 and MGs and all of those, they were the people who initially bought the hotel, quote unquote, which was Camp Calidore, turned it into a hotel, but they weren't very successful at it. I don't think it was really their business. So they sold it in 1949. And they sold it to 3 Jewish businessmen from Toronto. And weren't we lucky that they did? Because having sold it to them, they in fact did massive renovations, $100,000 worth in that money, so a number of millions of dollars that they did to make this into a beautiful luxury hotel for Jewish hotel goers. Wonderful irony. If I were back teaching English again and I wanted an example of irony, you'd have been listening to that in my English class. Yes, I know. You were going, oh no, not going back there again. Oh, good. Anyway, it was going to be turned into this luxury camp for Jewish people. And that was all very well and fine. And it was a beautiful place. You've got pictures of Germans playing tennis or badminton or whatever. And now you've got pictures of Jewish people playing in the same spot in front of the same building. But in actual fact, I think eventually Jewish people didn't want to be confined to a place or a resort that had been built for them. They wanted to be able to go anywhere. And for quite a while in Muskoka, Jewish people were not welcome anywhere. They were told, in fact, Gentiles only. So this was a luxury resort for Jewish vacationers, and a really wonderful jazz flute player got his start there. Yep. Mo Kaufman got his start there. And a really wonderful Jewish comedian got his start there. Used to play in Gravenhurst sometimes. Can you see it there, Megan? Oh, not on it. Anybody? So, okay. I'll leave you to mull that one over for a minute and see if you can come up with him. Somebody that you will probably have seen at some point. He actually played here a number of times at the Opera House and so on, but all over. And it was the place to go. They had the big bands, they had all the dancing, they had all the floor shows. People came from other resorts to this resort, to the Gateway, to spend an evening out. They took everybody to come and stay at that resort. Jewish resort though it was, they did in fact welcome the wife of one of the men who had been their captors, Werner Hirschman, his wife. And that's her there with her little boy. Werner Hirschman was his name, German soldier. Archie Moore trained there briefly. Yeah, former POW families were there. It couldn't last in the end because, as I say, I think Jewish people didn't want to feel as though they were in another almost like restricted, yeah, you know, oh yes, this is, you know, they wanted to go anywhere, you know, yeah. In the end, for a little while, that's what it looked like when I came here in 1973. That was the remains of the prisoner of war camp. And there were all kinds of bits and pieces of buildings and fences and you name it. And I bet anybody who grew up here roamed that property and yep, and sort of got to pick up little souvenirs of one kind or another. Exactly. I used to walk that property with Cyril Fry and Marion, and they would tell me all kinds of stories that they had heard. In actual fact, there's really part of the land there. That's the edge of the land. And there's what the prisoner of war camp looks like today. A very nice subdivision of very nice homes. We do have a new generation of visitors coming here now. A few years ago, I started a sort of a conversation, I guess we could call it, because some of it was on phone, some of it was by letter, with a man who was the son of a prisoner, German prisoner of war camp. He had read that I was doing these talks. He wanted to talk to me about it because his father had been here as a German prisoner of war. And his father had been very badly affected by that. He had never seen himself as somebody who was a prisoner, was worthy of being incarcerated. And so it really had affected his way of dealing with his family and so on. So Eckhart contacted me initially by letter, then by phone. Then we talked, and his daughter was graduating from high school. And so, in fact, Johanna and Eckhart came here and spent a week in Gravenhurst with me. And we had a wonderful time looking at the place where his father had been, but also, looking around the town and so on. And then they spent another week in other parts of Muskoka. His father was one of those people who taught that long list of courses. His father had taught science. And one of the things he said to me was, no wonder my father was always on me about my science. I never understood. I mean, he was an engineer. Why was he worrying about my science courses? Well, because he had taught science in the prisoner of war camp. And there's the prisoner of war camp today. Questions?
You mentioned at the beginning that the photographs when they walked in, is that Henry Fry that took that picture?
Yeah.
And you mentioned the Star Telegram.
There was the pictures that he took were for the Toronto Star. The first thing that I showed you, I think, had stuff about the stuff that was coming out in the